There was roughly 8.4 million people on the island of Ireland. Those 8.4 million people lived on land owned by 10,000 families. So you can do the math there. This was a very, very cruel system. And it was designed against Catholics ever getting above their station or being anything more than subservient to their English masters. Now, the landlords, some of them were Irish, but most of them were Anglo-Irish. And as I said before, I explained to you what Anglo-Irish is, because that's the aristocracy, the landed gentry, the people who owned the vast estates. Many of these people never set foot in Ireland. They were called absentee landlords. They could have owned 6,000 or 7,000 acres, had maybe 2,000 tenants, and employed Irish people as land agents or captains to collect the rent. Particularly cruel individuals. At that time, the English regarded the Irish as nothing more than the dirt on their shoes. English magazines and books and newspapers were full of caricatures about deformed Irish people, stupid Irish people, and they really had a laugh. The Irish were a subhuman race of people. Lazy, good-for-nothing people. Now, of the 8.4 million people, about two-thirds of them survived on small land holdings of about 5 acres or less. They had large families. And there was laws in place called the penal laws, which had made land holdings smaller and smaller and smaller. So if you had 12 children and you had 5 acres or 6 acres, say, when you died, you had to divide your 6 acres between the 12 children, so they all got a half an acre each. This was to ensure that the land holdings were so small that people were barely able to sustain a livelihood. Now, the staple diet of these peasant class of people was the potato. And the reason for that was because a potato can grow in poor soil, and it's a high yielding crop, and it's full of starch and protein and carbohydrates. The average Irish peasant labourer male ate 14 pounds of potatoes a day. And they grew potatoes here. If you look at, can you see on the left and right vertical ridges on the landscape? Can you see them? Once you spot them, you'll see them everywhere. Can you see them all over there on the right hand side? They grew them in these things called lazy beds. The English called these things lazy beds. Because this is such poor soil and such a horrible, cruel place to try and grow any crop, what they had to do was scrape together whatever minimum depth of soil there was into furrows where they could grow potatoes. Those are called drills, potato drills, D-R-I-L-L-S, drills. Now they had no animals, so they had no fertilizer, and what they did was they went to the seashore, which was back there at Lannan, and they gathered up seaweed and sand and brought it back in baskets and mixed it with the soil to create clay and soil, and then fertilized it with seaweed. These were called the lazy beds. The English said the lazy Irish grew a lazy crop in their lazy beds. Well, I come from a farm, and let me tell you that what I'm showing you has to be the most labour intensive way of growing any crop, having to create soil and then go and get sand and seaweed to fertilise it miles away. I think you'll agree. Look at them all up here. Look how far up they were forced to try and eke out a living. Now these people didn't make money from growing potatoes, they just lived off the potatoes. They had large families. 1845, the people woke up in this part of Ireland and many parts of the western seaboard to a foul smell all across the land, and they couldn't understand what it was. And when they looked out the window or went out their front door, they saw that the plants in their potato patches were black. The potato crop was struck by a terrible airborne disease called blight. Now this blight is said to came in a potato shipment from the United States, And it's an airborne disease, and it's carried by the wind. Little spores of blight are blown around, and if they attack a plant by morning, it said the whole crop will be wiped out by nightfall. Basically, it goes into the leaves, they start to blacken. It goes down the tuber, which is the stem of the potato plant, and into the potatoes down below. The people furiously dug the plants away and into the drills and the potatoes down below, and they soon found the source of the putrid smell. The potatoes were rotten. Rotten. 1845, they were able to survive, and whatever they had, maybe they had a cow or a pig or a sheep or something, and they were able to get through the winter and salvage whatever little bits of potato they could use for seed for the next year, and they planted the crops again. 1846, it happened again. Now, the landlords were starting to get concerned because these people were starting to starve. They had nothing to be able to work. They had no way of paying their rent. And the landlords were concerned that they didn't know what. Look at all the lazy beds out there. Look at them. Can you see them in it? Out on the left here. Look at these ridges.
Oh, yeah.
160 years ago, these people scraped with their hands through these things here to get food. And I think you'll agree with me. There's nothing lazy about that. Look how far up the mountainside they grow. You can still see the ridges all the way up there. Can you imagine walking back to Lannan and getting baskets of seaweed and sand and bringing them back here? So, the landlords started to get concerned. And they talked to the government in London, because at that time, of course, the whole of Ireland was ruled by England. And the government said, this is an Irish problem and therefore requires an Irish solution. And they asked, what does that mean? Well, these are your tenants on your land, so it's your problem. And as far as we're concerned, this is God's revenge on the lazy, good-for-nothing Irish. So as I said, they were a very Puritan, evangelical, conservative governments in London at that time, and they regarded the Irish as a subhuman race and just said, this is what happens when you live a life like that. So the landlords, and many of them were decent, tried to help their tenants, and many of them went bankrupt in the process. Many more started to evict them off their land. And remember, we saw when we were in County Clare, we saw the eviction scene on the wall. That's the type of apparatus that they used. Now, this was a horrendous scene. People were destitute. Tens of thousands of people were wandering the roads, starving to death. If you were lucky enough or unlucky enough, depending on what way you look at it, to get into a workhouse, you may have survived the hunger there. The hunger there. Now, here's a very poignant thing what I'm going to say to you. There was no famine in Ireland. A famine is when all the crops in your country fail. That didn't happen here. Ireland was awash with food. Awash with food. We've seen famines on the TV over the years, Ethiopia and Somalia and all these starving children in Africa. We've seen these famines. Those famines were real famines when there was no food available. Ireland was awash with food. England at the time was going through an industrial revolution. Big cities expanded. Places like London, Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, Glasgow, all these big cities full of industry. Shipbuilding, steam engine building, linen industry, steelworks. And many people flocked from rural areas of Britain to the cities to work in these big factories. And that population had to be fed. Where did they get the food? Here in Ireland. Corn was grown here. Cattle were raised, poultry was raised, pork, you name it. Shipments left Ireland on a daily basis, while the Irish died at the side of the road. 1847 got worse. 1847 was the worst year of the Great Hunger. It's known as Black 47. There's also a movie out now, you can get it on Netflix, called Black 47. It would come out last year. Watch that too. That'll give you a little bit of an insight into what went on. It's not much of a historical movie. It's kind of what I would call an Irish Western, but it's set during the times of the Great Hunger. Now, there's a fucking agent up alongside me here. Again, at this stage you're into hundreds of thousands of people dead. The people that were wandering the roads, soon a disease took hold called famine fever. Basically nowadays it would be scurvy, that would what it would be. But this killed many, many people. So the next thing, the landlords again appealed to the English and said, you have to do something about this. These people are starving to death. Our estates are going bankrupt. There's nothing we can do. So there was a change of government and there was a new Treasury Minister called Lord Charles Trevelyan. And he came up with a brainwave. He said, we shall feed them. Now, they didn't feed them the best of stuff that left here. All the corn and all the produce that was leaving here under armed guard. They didn't feed them that. He decided to buy cheap Indian corn from the United States. It was the Native Americans that first discovered barley and wheat and corn by a cross-pollination of different seeds. And a lot of Indian corn was imported for distilling and animal feed and stuff like that. So they bought shiploads of Indian corn. And they decided, well, they said, okay, we'll feed the people. Shall we give it to them? No, we won't. We'll sell it to them. Now, at that time, as I was saying, Britain was a massive empire, very powerful, very strong, and ruled 1/4 of the globe under Queen Victoria. And they built their empire, their great empire, with the spirit of free trade and enterprise and trading and economic growth all over the world. And they said, if you give a race of people like the Irish handouts, you're just encouraging a handout society, and these people are too dumb to ever get away from that, and it will be the beginning of the end. It will rock the whole stability and status of our free trade and enterprise. So we have to get some money in return. We'll sell them the corn. So they set up what they called famine relief schemes. Remember I showed you the wall in Cork and Cove, and I told you to remember it, whenever the big wall called the penny wall, where people in exchange for their hired labour were paid a penny a day, and with that penny they were able to purchase Trevelyan's corn. Now, the corn was of that poor a quality that many, many people got very ill when consuming this corn, and more died. At this stage, 2 years into it, you're talking about 500,000 people dead. Another brainwave. The landlord said, right, we've had enough. This country is too overpopulated. There are 8.4 million people. Our estates are going to rack and ruin, subsidising these tenants. It's time to get rid of them. So they decided to export the people as well as exporting the produce. And the landlords paid for the passage of their tenants overseas. They hired freight ships that had never been designed for passenger transport, piloted by unscrupulous captains, and paid to get the people to leave the shores of Ireland. These ships became known as the Coffin Ships. Well in excess of 1 million people, almost 1.5 million people, were put on these ships and exported out of Ireland. They went to the UK, they went to the United States, they went to Canada, they went to New Zealand, they went to Australia. And many, about 500,000 of the 1 million people that were exported died on these coffin ships. It's said that sharks followed these ships on their journeys because every day they had a ready meal. Can you imagine the journey to, say, United States, a 6-week journey, jammed below deck in unsanitary conditions? There was 15 people every 6 square feet. That's how they were jammed in. There's a couple of replicas of famine ships in Ireland. Maybe on some other tour you might get a chance to visit them. But horrendous conditions. The hunger went on for another 4 years. It lasted from 1845 to 1851. And at the end of it, Ireland's population was decimated by 50%. This particular area here, the Mam Valley, had 250 people every square mile. Now that's 160 years ago. You can see it's never recovered from that. You can see how sparsely populated the Mam Valley is. The whole thing was ethnic cleansing, if you ask me. Now, many scholars, smarter people than me, and students and history buffs have studied that particular period in Irish history, and they come up with the same thing that I come up with. Although the English did not create the conditions which caused the failure of the potato crop, they certainly manipulated those conditions to carry out genocide here in this country. I have no doubt in my mind that's what happened. And as I said, at the end of that, there was a population of less than 5 million on the island of Ireland. There are 38.5 million people in the United States which claim Irish ancestry. That's one of the statistics. There's an Irish bar nearly in every city in the world. That's probably why, because there's Irish everywhere. Irish people have been exported all over the world. And it was such a horrendous time. People asked me, what did the Catholic Church do anything? It was just far too big an epidemic for anybody to get involved, except somebody like the government, where they could have fed them. But it was a horrible time, a horrible time. And always remember that it's not a famine. A famine is when all the crops fail. In Ireland, only the potato crop failed. Now, remember this as well. The failure of the potato crop just didn't happen in Ireland. It happened all over Europe as well. It happened in the Highlands of Scotland. Whoever the clan chiefs over there, who were responsible for their clan, they fed their people. And the English government introduced measures to help feed the population up there. In mainland Europe, governments immediately ordered the cancellation of the export of all produce and foods, and the making of beer and wine and spirits was also cancelled, that there would be enough grain for people to eat. So the potato crop failed all over Ireland, or all over Europe. It was just Ireland that suffered the most because nothing was done. The conditions were manipulated to make sure that the Irish would be, that Ireland would be depopulated from the lazy, good-for-nothing English. A horrific period in Irish history, never ever forgotten. Never forgotten. And one of the things that came out of it as well was a deep mistrust of English governments and English laws. A deep mistrust. And never again would Irish people allow something like that to happen. It also instilled a very much patriotic flames in the Irish people. It was always, I wouldn't say it was used as a rallying cry, because it was such a sad, catastrophic time and period that it was, they weren't going to start using that as a cry to attain Irish freedom. It was just something that's in us. As an Irishman, it's hard to explain. It's in our DNA. It's in our being. It's in our whole way of life, where we think about that. And it was such an unspeakable horror that we just kind of keep it inside. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
And another thing it did with us as well, and I can attain to this because I come from a rural background, it gave us an obsession with the land. Sometimes a dangerous, and I still think a dangerous obsession with the land. Because the Irish people have been dispossessed of their land for over 8 centuries. And then what happened was invaders took our land off us, then forced us to rent it back from them. And then when we couldn't rent it back, they starved us out of it and threw us at the side of the road. And that whole way of thinking is so much in rural peoples. The land is more important than the blood that flows through our veins. It's more important than the air that we breathe. We have a small farm, 87 acres, and if you give my father 87 million, it's not for sale. It's not for sale. It is more important to him than anything he has around him. Irish people have fought for land, killed for land, and died for land. In fact, it's a complete obsession, because they were so dispossessed from the land. And that movie, The Field, shows partly of one man's obsession with the land and the tragic consequences that can happen when he allows his obsession to take control of his life. So I'd encourage you all to watch that. It's not about the famine. If you want to see a movie about the hunger, watch that one, Black 47. But if you want to try and understand about Irish people's obsession with the land, watch The Field. It's a great movie. I think it's a fantastic movie. But it's such a big period. Now, the Trail of Tears that I showed you up the Dula Valley. Okay, people from Louisburg, there's a town up there about 20 miles up that valley called Louisburg. And in order to receive any intervention from any government or any type of subsidy or free food or money or anything at all, you had to be assessed. Probably the same way nowadays you'd have to be assessed if you needed a wheelchair, or if you needed a car, or if you needed a carer. Do you know the way you go before a board and you're assessed whether you get these things for or not? Yeah. So there was two gentlemen that were members of the Famine Relief Board, and they were to meet people in Louisburg for assessment, about 100 people. And whatever happened, there was some mix-up about the times, and the two guys got on their horses and they travelled down the Dula Valley and stayed at, I forget the name of the house now, Dula Lodge maybe. No, there's another name for it, but there was a lodge there, a big house, and they stayed there. And the people, this was the depth of winter. They stayed there, and the people walked in the snow in their bare feet. Destitute, starving families, men, women and children, walked the 25 miles to the lodge. And when they knocked on the door, they were told that the men were at table and were not to be disturbed, and that they would be back in Louisburg at 7:30 in the morning. And those people turned and went to walk back to Louisburg. And in the depths of winter, in the dead of night, all of them perished. Not all of them, a few of them survived, but the bulk of the people died of hypothermia and starvation on that walk, that famine walk as it's known. Now, the 1831 Indian Removal Act in the United States, introduced by Old Hickory. What was his name? President what? President Andrew Jackson, yes. Set about removing the Seminole Indian nation from their traditional lands in Florida and Georgia, and forced marched them in the depths of winter, relocating them to Oklahoma. And many of that nation, of which the Cherokees are a big group, perished on the Trail of Tears. Isn't that right? Wasn't there about 1,500 Native Americans died in that march? At least, maybe. So that was 1831. 1847, that one happened in Louisburg, and the American Indians, the Cherokee Indians, Choctaw Indians, they were Choctaw, part of the Seminole Nation. They raised $175 and sent it over to Ireland as part of a famine relief. Only 16 years after their own Trail of Tears. Now, if you're ever on the other side of Cork, away out past Cove, 2 years ago, there was a beautiful sculpture there which is a big stainless steel sculpture of Indian feathers in the shape of a bowl, and that's a reminder of what the Choctaw Nation gave to Ireland at that time. It was a massive. That's like 30,000 today. I think $175 back then, maybe more. And the chief of the Choctaws were over, and the Irish government was there, our president and all, and it was a big thing. Now, I don't know why it's in Cork. I just can't understand why it's in Cork. But I thought it should have been up here somewhere. But that was a recognition of that gift of the $175. So that's the Trail of Tears, the Irish Trail of Tears. And every year there's a walk on the anniversary of that to remember that Trail of Tears, where people they kind of fast for the day and they walk from Louisburg to, what's the name of the lodge? Oh, I can't, it's in my head and I just can't get it out. So it's about 20 miles one way. So that's the effect. Ireland's population never recovered. Ireland's population is the highest it's ever been at the minute, 6.4 million people on the island. But that's due to a massive boost in population, massive population growth, and about 500,000 immigrants in here as well. So we're up at 6.4 million. Up until that, when I grew up in the 70s and I learned about Irish population, I always learned it was between 4.5 and 5 million. So it never recovered. It's only starting to recover now 160 years later. Terrible times. If you're interested in that type of that period in Irish history, there's a great book by a woman called Cecile Woodham Smith, and it's called The Great Hunger, the Irish Famine. It's the definitive authority on that period in time. So thanks for listening to that. Thank you for your patience and your quiet. But massive subject in Irish history.